We're in a place called Peenemünde on the Baltic Sea island of Usedom. 73 years ago, this ruin was top secret. A new dimension of warfare was being prepared here, a wonder weapon in the fight against the Allies. Today, it's strictly forbidden to enter, and yet there are photos of the interior circulating on the internet. Fascinating pictures that have caught the interest of these two women.
Let's have a look.
For 3 months, Annette Petrich and Theresa Engel have been waiting for permission. Today, they are finally allowed to do a fashion photo shoot in this building. But the adventure is not without its dangers, so there's a guide to accompany them. And protective helmets are mandatory. This is a dilapidated building. Parts of it are really coming down. You can already see that from the outside, so watch out and we'll be fine. Despite the dangers, there's a great sense of anticipation about this lost place.
It's dilapidated, but it's not yet full of graffiti, because nobody can get in. And of course, it also has a historical background, which brings out the mystical atmosphere in such a picture.
This historian will tell us more about the historical background. First of all, Philipp Aumann shows his guests the way into the building. Annette and Theresa look at the huge ruin in amazement. What kind of place is this? How old might the building be? Why was it so huge? And how long has it been empty? It's been in ruins since the end of the war. At first they tried to blow it up, but that didn't work. Essentially, it's been falling apart for 70 years now.
It is really overwhelming, especially this height. You rarely see open ceilings like this. It's just phenomenal. I think it's crazy, especially that nature is so present here, although it's actually a huge building. And yet there are trees everywhere and moss and ferns, a mini jungle right in here. It's just incredible.
Only a few details still remind us of what went on here 75 years ago. There are remains of railway tracks on the ground. Did a whole train run through this industrial cathedral? What kinds of machines were mounted on these concrete bases? One thing is clear, the war has left its mark on this place. Annette and Theresa start preparing for their photo shoot. An actress is about to arrive whom they want to photograph against this unique backdrop, and she has very little time. Philipp Aumann accompanies the model to the site. Paola is already wearing her costume for the production. It's also her first time here, and she wonders what kind of spooky place this is. To understand that, we have a bit of a look around to see where we actually are. This is the site of the National Socialists' infamous Army Research Center. The largest preserved building is still there. In front of it, we find a rocket shell. This is where the world's first large rocket was developed, the much-praised wonder weapon that was to bring about the final victory when Germany was already in ruins. With this propaganda, Hitler's regime tried to prevent its downfall. In vain. It was an object of hope, the hope that new technology would help win this war, which in itself was hopeless, and that's why such an enormous effort was put into this. The effort was indeed gigantic. The Nazis invested $500 million Reichsmark in the construction of the Army Research Center and the development of the rocket. Originally it was called Aggregat 4, but the Nazis finally called it V2. It took the famous rocket engineer Werner von Braun and his team many launch attempts before the world's first large rocket actually became a horrible reality for thousands of innocent civilians. In October 1942, the engineers made a breakthrough. The V2 reached almost 5 times the speed of sound and flew 84 kilometers. In 1944, it flew as high as 174 kilometers and was the first man-made missile to reach outer space. The rocket was propelled by an explosive mixture, alcohol and liquid oxygen. Between 13 and 15 tons of liquid oxygen were produced per day in large industrial plants with large compressors. For such gigantic quantities, a correspondingly huge factory was needed. It took more than 2 years to build the 73-metre-long factory hall. In August 1942, the plant was finally put into operation. 73 years later, in this once so ominous location, the photo shoot begins. At the place where photographer Annette is now directing her model, 5 huge aggregates were installed. We can now show past and present in the same picture. An air separation plant produced the fuel for the rocket. The air was compressed under extreme pressure and simultaneously cooled down until it liquefied and the oxygen could be separated from the nitrogen. The entire hall was filled with machines, pressure pipes and tanks. 15 tons of oxygen at a temperature of minus 183 degrees was produced every day. The factory was so huge that an entire steam locomotive with several pressure tank wagons actually fitted in here. The trains picked up the cargo and brought the liquid oxygen to where the rockets were refueled. Five tons of liquid oxygen, 1/3 of the daily production, filled the tank of one rocket. The V2 was 14 meters high. When fully fueled, it weighed almost 13 tons. Its engine produced 650,000 horsepower and burned the incredible amount of 125 liters of fuel per second. By comparison, a jumbo jet consumes less than 3 liters of kerosene per second. The rocket that was developed here is certainly an enormous technical innovation, perhaps the greatest transport revolution of the 20th century. But we must not forget that an essentially criminal objective was achieved here by criminal means. In the last 2 years of the war, the Nazis fired more than 3,000 V2 rockets towards England, France and Belgium. Some 8,000 people were killed. Even more people were killed in the production of the V2. Historians estimate that up to 20,000 forced laborers died in connection with the production of these rockets. It was this program which was so cynically called extermination through work. So it was the idea that the concentration camp prisoners should be killed at work by the working and living conditions. Only a few hundred meters away from the oxygen plant is the Historical Technical Museum. It commemorates the history of this inhuman technological revolution. The large building is the former power station, in which the enormous quantities of electricity for the production of oxygen were generated. Its history after the end of the Second World War is also told here. The Americans had no scruples about securing the services of the German scientists around Wernher von Braun for the emerging Cold War. In the USA, the Nazi engineers were allowed to continue developing the rocket without any repercussions. And the Soviet Union also built up its own rocket arsenal based on the captured V2 technology. It's an indisputable fact. The history of the large-scale rocket, of rockets being sent into space, all began from here. Back to the photo shoot at the oxygen plant. Annette is satisfied with the result. And yet, the whole thing feels strange when she considers the history of this location.
During the shoot you might switch it off a bit, but I think there's a special atmosphere there. That's how I felt anyway. Yes, especially when you have a rest after the shoot or in between, and you look around a bit and ask yourself, what was it like here back then? On one hand, it's totally abstract, but on the other hand, it feels somehow oppressive.
And the future? Historians would prefer to preserve the oxygen plant in this condition, as a broken monument, which visitors are not allowed to enter, but are allowed to look into. So far, there's no money to secure the ruin, but the oxygen plant in Peenemünde could become a valuable memorial to the inhuman megalomania of the National Socialists.